Good evening. Welcome to the non-motorized transportation plan update. This evening, we will have Lene Wells from Aligned Planning introduce the different components to the non-motorized transportation plan. Once she has had a chance to present the plan, she will be able to take questions. Staff will be able to take questions. So most of the time will be opened up for those questions. With that, I will turn it over to Lene.
Right, wonderful. Hi, everybody. My name is Lene Wells. I'm an urban planner, and I'm with Aligned Planning. I'm based in the city of Grand Rapids, and I've been working with the city of Battle Creek to finalize and finish up the non-motorized transportation plan. So first off, I just wanted to thank everybody for being here today and for participating in this project. This has been a long time coming. We certainly got caught up in the pandemic. This began before the pandemic, and then we had obviously a lot of changes that came with that time period following the pandemic, and we're happy to be picking this up again because it is so important that we work towards transportation choices in the city of Battle Creek. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm an urban planning consultant, and I've been working with the city leaders and spending a lot of time going through all of the previous documents and public engagement and public input that had been provided through the various community engagement processes that happened. So this document is a culmination and all the work that was done during that time period. The planner, Eric Felt, many of you might know him, worked on this project extensively along with city engineering, transportation, and planning staff. So this document really represents a collective voice, the voice of those community members that participated in those engagement meetings, as well as all of the voices that participated in other community planning documents that relate to non-motorized transportation. So I'm going to go through a little bit about that history, how this came to be, and then provide you with an overview of what's contained in this document. When we talk about non-motorized transportation, it's also important to remember that this is kind of one component of your overall community planning framework. In Battle Creek, we focus on housing, we focus on zoning and land use, we focus on infrastructure, we focus on parks and recreation and trails and economic development. And the piece that relates to transportation is so essential because in a family's household budget, transportation costs are second after housing. So when we can provide choices for people to move about a community, we're helping them to have more disposable income, to be able to afford other opportunities that they're looking for their family and for themselves. So transportation is essential. This non-motorized transportation plan contains 6 chapters. It's broken into our executive summary. We talk about the background and why transportation planning is important. We establish terms, a common set of terminology so that we're all using the same language, because oftentimes when one person says something like bike lane, another person might have a vision in their head of a certain type of bike lane. So we want to make sure that we have a consistent set of terminology. We also looked at the current transportation situation in Battle Creek with non-motorized facilities. So we looked at where the bike lanes are, where trails are. We in chapter 4, we identified the different types of non-motorized facilities, and I'll get into that detail in a little bit, as well as the best practices for those. We have recommendations for where those bike and pedestrian facilities would locate, as well as an implementation strategy. So that is the whole document. It is not a 200-page document by any means. This is a document that's very succinct, to the point. We want it to be very user-friendly. The reason for the user-friendliness is that many different groups will be using this. And so we want to make sure that it's easy to understand where these new proposed facilities could locate. And that way the city is better able to plan for them in their capital improvement programming in subsequent years. So as I mentioned, that executive summary is that overarching section of the plan. The introduction and background talks a lot about our public engagement efforts and why non-motorized transportation matters. I know this data is from 2017, but this map is really telling to me, and this is something we worked on with the city GIS staff. The green illustrates the household income. So the darker green would be incomes that are over $55,000 to $75,000 to upwards of $100,000 in the household. So that's sort of the outer ring. And the inner ring, the lighter green, would be that household income that is from the $0 to $35,000 range per year. And what I notice when I look at this is the concentration of bicycle and pedestrian crash history where we have lower income households. And as I mentioned earlier, we have that connection between the cost of transportation, specifically the single occupancy vehicle, and household choice, as well as opportunities that people have when they're sort of saddled with only one choice, being the vehicle. The average cost of owning a vehicle in the United States, I think AAA says it's about $8,000 to $13,000 a year. So when there are safer choices like taking a bike or walking or using the bus to supplement maybe the vehicle use, or take a household from one car to two car, you're putting money back into the community, back into the household, and recirculating that in Battle Creek. So we also know that because this crash history is sort of centralized where we have the lower income populations, that we have strategies for providing safer ways to accommodate bicyclists and people walking and people taking the bus. So the goal is not only to provide more choices, but it's also to have safer spaces for those activities. So this matters because we're trying to solve for those two main issues. I mentioned earlier our public engagement, and we know that occurred during COVID times and beyond, but we worked with the neighborhood planning councils. We did extensive social media and outreach. We had a website specifically devoted to this planning process. There was a community-wide survey that went out. We held workshops. We did mapping activities where people identified where there were gaps in the bike trail or bike path system, where there were gaps in sidewalks, where we needed to kind of fill in and make sure that we had a network to provide safe biking, walking, and connecting our bus transit facilities. After the public engagement, the stakeholder group that was working on this plan developed vision statements. So these are kind of overarching priorities for non-motorized transportation. And those include things like improving healthy choices and recreation options, because we know that oftentimes people walk or bike to parks and community assets like green spaces and the river. We want to provide more transportation choice, as I mentioned earlier. We want that transportation to be safe. There's also an environmental component that we often forget about when we're choosing walking or biking. So that was another vision for this plan. Increasing the economic benefit, as I mentioned earlier, about the household budget. The community pride. People do tend to really boast about their biking and their walking and their water trails. So anytime we provide these amenities, people do get a boost, and they tend to brag about it and talk about the wonderful options in a community. And then We also know that as we provide more choices for people to move about in a safe way, that we can reduce the dependency on parking. We can transition perhaps parking lots that perhaps sit empty to developable lands, and that helps increase our tax base even more. So there are many different ways that this focus on non-motorized transportation can improve all of these, can improve the community. We also know that non-motorized transportation isn't just the job of one department or only just the city of Battle Creek. Our street spaces, our right-of-way is planned, designed, and maintained by our Department of Public Works. So they're involved and they have a role in this. Parks and recreation, we know that people link up with recreation facilities and our linear park and our pathways. Transit, that is a big partner in non-motorized transportation, because we say that anyone who takes the bus is a pedestrian on either side of that trip. So it's very important that we think about how are people walking from their point of origin to the bus stop, and once they get off the bus, how do they reach their destination? So providing those safe links helps to support our transit system. Police and fire, first responders. I have some data here in this great book. If anyone is passionate about non-motorized transportation, it's called Right of Way by Angie Schmidt. And in 2018, and this data continues, this trend continues, but there were more pedestrians killed in the United States than at any point in any generation. It says in the United States, about 50% more people die while walking or using a mobility device today than a decade ago. There's certainly other data in this book that's really compelling, but it's our first responders and our fire that often are the ones who are at the scene of unfortunate circumstances that can happen between pedestrians, bicyclists, and motor vehicles. So they're part of this strategy as well. Our schools, because we know that children who are under the age of 16 aren't even able to drive, right? So their only transportation choice is, with a parent in a car, or walking or biking or taking the bus on their own. Our Planning Commission and City Commission have a role. City Commission approves budgets and helps with our capital improvement planning. And the Planning Department and Planning Commission look at site plans, and often it's individual development projects that have a role in building new sidewalk, repairing sidewalk, providing bike racks, different tools that the private development can bring to the table to support and foster a community of non-motorized transportation solutions. And then, of course, neighborhood groups. So it's people living in the city of Battle Creek. It's the bike community, people who bike to work. It's other groups that are involved that want to see these different transportation options. So there are a lot of people that can be part of this this movement, I guess I would call it. The next chapter in the plan relates to our background conditions. So and our common terms. And as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to start with a document and a process where we're all speaking the same language and have a similar vision in our mind when we use the terminology. And so when I talk about non-motorized transportation, as I've alluded to earlier, it's walking, biking, it can be scooters, it can be skateboards, one wheels, that bike share. Those are all the non-motorized transportation elements that we speak about, and kayak and stand-up paddleboard when we think about our water trails. Facilities is just a general term that we use for anything in the street space that would be used by anyone on a non-motorized device. We often talk about a network, and when we think about a network, that's a way that we connect all of these different facilities throughout the community to destinations, to different parks, different, where we have workforce or schools. It's how do we get people from point A to point B? And then when we talk about wayfinding, that would be the signage, that would be the markings we use in the street or adjacent to parks and trails to provide people with the routing information. We have other terms in the plan as well. This is just a selection. I mentioned earlier that we did this plan, but not in a vacuum, that we worked with other entities, and we also looked at what the existing conditions are in the community. So we identified our streets and highways, what facilities are city-owned, which ones are MDOT, the Michigan Department of Transportation, because then they have jurisdiction over what happens in the area between the curbs. We worked with the transit entity to better understand some priorities that they have around connecting their bus stops to sidewalks and bike routes. We realize that there's train passengers that are, they're arriving or departing and often may or may not have a car. And so they might be walking or biking to a destination. We thought about the trail network, and then of course the existing bike facilities and trails and parks and sidewalks. We also looked at plans that have been developed by the city, but also by other entities that focus on non-motorized transportation in the region and within the state. So those plans are listed here on the screen. When we get to chapter 4, that's where we have the full list of all the different types of bike lanes and facilities within the street space that help provide safer, dedicated, or mixed transportation routes for these different non-motorized means. And each one of those has best practices. So I've got an example on the screen just of the traditional bike lane. So that's an example of one facility. So the bike lane, we describe the function of it, why it's important, what the typical dimensions are of that facility, the benefit, where they would be recommended, different items that could be part of it, like signage or different pavement markings, and things to consider when placing a bike lane. So this facility, the traditional bike lane, is just one of the other facilities in the plan. And I've got the plan open, and I can tell you, we also describe the buffered bike lane. So that would be one of those bike lanes that has either a painted buffer between the bike lane and the travel lane. Maybe it has bollards in it. Maybe it's separated by concrete barricades. There's different ways to protect that bike lane from the moving vehicle other than just a painted stripe on the road. We also have the same facility standards for sidewalks, for intersections where two streets come together. We have standards for mid-block crossing. So that's often where you're not crossing people at the intersection, but they're walking across the street in the middle of the block. And there's some best practices to make sure that they're protected from oncoming traffic via pedestrian islands or other tools. We have information about different signage, like flashing pedestrian crossing lights or beacons that can be placed in the street. And then pathways and trails and water trails. So all of those are described in the document, and we encourage you to take a look at those. So now that we have an understanding about the why we're doing this, and the common understanding of the tools and the types of facilities that can be used. And we have an understanding of what is in place today and what these other entities within our community desire as priorities. It was time, or it is time in the document, for us to look at how we go through the analysis as to where to place these different facilities. So where to place sidewalks, where to place the bike lanes or buffered bike lanes. And through the community engagement process, we learned a few things about those priorities. So as we're thinking about future non-motorized facilities, the top priority is improving or placing those in close proximity to schools, parks, employment centers, and dense residential areas. The second one is considering the street and the adjacent land uses. So often there might be streets that perhaps are wider than they need to be. Maybe they have more lanes than is necessary because of changing traffic patterns. So maybe there's opportunities to kind of rebalance that space of the street and dedicate a little bit more to the bike or the sidewalk and still accommodate the bus and the vehicle. So it's kind of looking at where those opportunities might exist for rebalancing. Traffic patterns, where do we have high instances of crashes? We looked at that crash map, and so maybe we want to focus some of these solutions in areas that are common crash areas. And then the jurisdictional ownership, of course. So it might be harder to do bike or non-motorized improvements on roadways where the city does not have jurisdiction. It's not that it can't happen or it's impossible. It's just, it may not be the low-hanging fruit that people talk about. So, as we think about that, to maybe prioritize where the city has jurisdiction and still work on the other streets, of course, that are MDOT streets, but, try to balance the level of effort. So chapter 5 then is that recommended network, and we're going to have links to the network maps on the city's website. They're also in the draft plan, and they are a bit of a work in progress because we know we need to add some key street names and to those maps, but they will be available to you. So our maps identify the citywide routes so that it's obvious to see where we're building this network and connecting to the facilities that we already have. And that map, because our city is so large, it is hard to see it all on a screen. So we cut it into quadrants so that you can kind of zoom in to the different quadrants of the city. We also have a map of the water trail. And then we have a section on ranking, the decision-making ranking, so that city leaders and the Department of Public Works and others can prioritize where these improvements would be made in the future. Through the community engagement process, I know I mentioned those 4 key criteria for non-motorized facilities. We also have a list of 11, I guess I would call them the decision-making matrix. And this list of 11, many of these are carryovers from the previous non-motorized transportation plan in the city, and they were reaffirmed through the community engagement process. And the reason that these are in the document is that oftentimes when we're dealing with the right-of-way in the city, there are so many competing interests, right? We have to provide space for the, vehicles. We need curb and gutter. We need sidewalks. We need street trees. We need the bike lanes. We need ample space for underground utilities, water, sewer, fiber optics. So there is just so much happening underground that we often forget about that needs to be accommodated. So this decision-making matrix helps the city leadership when they're prioritizing projects for that capital improvement planning. So, safety is number one. We want to look at the daily usage of those facilities, the ease of implementation, that proximity to parks and schools, and how building this new bike lane or trail extension connects to existing trails or bike lanes, convenience, how it might impact vehicle traffic. So this list is an important one for the city in terms of implementation. The plan has priority streets that were identified by the public and through the public engagement process. This entire list is included in the plan document that you're able to download on our website. But you'll see that these segments are very specific. They relate to specific street names and exactly what is desired, right? So if it's bike lanes, if it's a wide shoulder, if it's sidewalk, this whole list is one of those, I think, priority and important checklists for the city to use as they're moving forward with decision-making related to future investments. And then that list continues. So looking at 26th Street between Iroquois and Columbia, various intersections where refuge islands are needed so people have a safe place to wait when they're crossing the street. Parkway Drive between Washington and Montgomery, Hamlin between South Washington and Michigan for a buffered bike lane. I'll go back to the front, a road diet on M89 from Washington to the city limits. I know that that's one of those MDOT rights of way, but it could be a collaboration between both entities. So this is quite an extensive list for the key priority segments in the community. And then I've included in this presentation the overall network map, and I know that this is really hard to read on the screen, and there is a lot of information on this document and this map. It's definitely going to be something that you might want to spend some time with when you're at home, or I'm sure the city may be able to print you an 11x17 or copy of it if you'd like. There are a lot of icons on here that show bus stops. And the reason that we're showing that is, as I mentioned earlier, is that consideration that we need to make for people who are taking the bus because they are either walking or biking on either side of that trip. And there are many locations in the community where the bus stop might not have any safe place for somebody to wait or to even walk to a sidewalk or cross the street. So we wanted to show how the proposed extensions of some of these bike routes and new bike routes help to fill that gap and provide a safer location for people who are choosing that mode of transportation. So on this map, what we've identified are the different bike and non-motorized facilities. And we've identified where they're existing, that is a solid line, and then where they're proposed, and that would be the dashed line. And then we've done kind of those quadrant maps. So the northwest quadrant, the northeast quadrant, and this is the downtown area where we certainly have more density, more people living, more people working. And so we're going to have more network there than in other parts of Battle Creek. The southeast corridor, you'll see there's still some gaps, where sidewalk is not yet proposed. And then the southwest area where we're planning for additional bike lane and buffered bike lanes. And then here's also that central downtown area again. We included the water trail network and locations where kayak launches could be located, and the concept of having a blue way, which is a terminology that is used throughout the state of Michigan, but also in other river abundant states and communities, is this idea of these blue ways where people can hop on the river or the blue way and get from various points from one point to another in the community. And the expectation or thought is that where we have these kayak launches, that there might be things like a rack to put the kayak or a place to lock that kayak. There might be wayfinding signage, perhaps a restroom or a drinking fountain. Perhaps the maps identify where restaurants or other businesses are located to support people who could be traveling on the riverway. This is likely more of a recreation focus than, say, commuter travel. The implementation section has a list of policies, and I know that this is also hard to read on the screen. A lot of the policies and ideas relate back to those vision statements that we shared earlier. But the overarching concept, as I mentioned, was that safety piece, and the idea that we're kind of rebalancing street spaces and recognizing that we want to make room for all different modes of transportation where we can. And that would provide more kind of equity in these different modes, because not everyone can afford a vehicle, not everyone can drive. And so, you know, we have this whole population that desires to have other ways to move about. Other policies include, you know, connecting those bus stops to sidewalks or different non-motorized facilities, having wayfinding, ensuring that sidewalks are free and clear of debris, and that they're able to be used year-round. That perhaps there's a policy about dedicated sidewalk and pathway funding in the downtown for maintenance and repair. That there's that adjacent neighborhoods to the downtown are connected via non-motorized pathways. That bike racks and storage for bikes are located in a close distance to transit stops and to businesses, and that there's continued collaboration with MDOT and the county and the various user groups. In addition to just the facilities in the road, there's also a set of short and long-term accomplishments that support the actual physical improvements in that street space. So that would be the various city departments working to review the data on an annual basis to perhaps set goals around limiting or reducing pedestrian or bicycle crashes to the extent that we're able to. We know that we can't change human behavior, of course, but you know, perhaps with some of the improvements that are made, the safety is improved and that crash data goes down. Publishing the network map, making it available for people to use and to plan their trips and know that they do have places to ride their bike, and they could, you know, perhaps choose to run out to the grocery store or do those short trips in something other than their car. Installing sidewalks and pedestrian safety features, that's another short-term accomplishment desired in this plan. Attaining the gold rating through the League of American Bicyclists. The League of American Bicyclists has several different criteria for rating a community in terms of how well they're providing facilities and education and awareness around biking. when you have that gold rating, it often opens you up for grants and different funding. So it's something that many communities are looking to achieve. Having wayfinding signage, again, that is so important. That can be either physical maps, it can be QR codes, it can be on websites. But the more that people understand where the network is and how they can get from point A to point B, it helps lower the barrier to entry. You know, you become more confident in taking and choosing to take a bus or to ride a scooter or to take your bike somewhere. Another short-term accomplishment is a community outreach policy for non-motorized transportation improvements. So it's the city working with the neighborhood groups. It's perhaps doing things like sending postcards or doing some kind of targeted outreach to make sure that when these improvements are planned or going into a neighborhood, that there's communication and collaboration. Long-term, it's looking at things like a citywide bike rack program. People need to know that they can lock their bike up in a safe way. Otherwise, they're probably not going to bike somewhere. They don't want to have something happen to their bike. Water trail designation is another goal and a long-term accomplishment of this plan. And similarly, having that designation helps the city qualify for additional grants and funding for a water trail network that can be used for signage, for marketing. It can help with tourism. More and more people are looking for these recreation amenities when they're making choices about where to visit in the summer months. Media campaigns are very important. That helps with raising the awareness of people who are driving often about, you know, that bikes are on the road, that look out for, you know, have a safe distance when you're passing a bike. It's educating the people biking or on scooters or skateboards that, you know, having reflective gear is important, that you need to follow the same rules of the road as the vehicle. So it goes both ways when we're talking about media campaigns or education around bike riding and safe driving. The Safe Routes to Schools program is another long-term accomplishment, and that is another project that has funding associated with it. And that's something that's usually led by the schools and with support from the city. And that's all about safe ways for kids to walk from home to their school. There's another long-term accomplishment about a dedicated funding stream for transportation improvements. And then integrating various placemaking elements into these bike routes or trails. So that might be benches, it might be educational signage, it might be interactive or interpretive information. Say the trail or bikeway is adjacent to a cultural or historic site. So it's kind of amplifying that, the placemaking elements that go with it. Sometimes there's programs where there are bike lanes through a downtown or a neighborhood, and there are like neighborhood specific signs or neighborhoods name the route. I mean, there's different ways of making sure that the community that's using the facility and that's near and adjacent to the facility takes some ownership over it, because they're the ones who would call and say, hey, there's a downed branch blocking the bike lane. Can you come and help, you know, remove that? Or we could really use some street sweeping here. There's a lot of debris in this bike lane and we're worried about it. So it's kind of creating that open and transparent communication between the city and neighborhoods and users of these non-motorized facilities. Other accomplishments would be in, these are long-term accomplishments by 2035. A bike share program, we have one today, but it's kind of furthering that program, having more maps available for biking, walking, and kayaking. Ongoing accomplishments to help with non-motorized transportation would be perhaps land acquisition to continue our non-motorized the trail linear park system. That's often off the street. So that would require some land acquisition, more education, and even enforcement, perhaps. Oftentimes people park their car in bike lanes, so there is a level of enforcement that may be necessary if available. Continued coordination with user groups, and then to revisit the plan. We don't want it to sit on the shelf. We want to make sure that the Planning Commission is thinking about this as new development projects come in. That the planning department is thinking about it when it is reviewing a site plan, that the parks department is thinking about it when they're maybe improving the park and perhaps they want to put a bike repair station in, or they want to do a little spur from the bike lane directly into the park, and maybe there's no ramp there, it's a curb. So they might think, ooh, if we want to support biking to the park, we need to cut into this curb and make it accessible so someone can bike right into the park, or provide bike racks. So that's how we want to think through revisiting the plan with all of those different departments that we talked about earlier, who have a role in fostering this movement towards non-motorized transportation in Battle Creek. I'm almost done. There are a few different ordinance amendments. So this plan is a set of kind of guidelines and recommendations. It's not law. It's not an ordinance. It's a set of guides and aspirations. There are things that can be codified and made into ordinance or amended in existing ordinance to help support non-motorized transportation. So a few things that this plan identifies as opportunities when it comes to kind of codification and putting more teeth into this document would be the having a complete streets and vision zero ordinance or policy. Having an ordinance amendment in our zoning code, perhaps, that talks about sidewalk, provision of sidewalk or pathway. If, say, you have a vacant lot and on our non-motorized transportation map, there's a future pathway or sidewalk that in our ordinance, if you're developing, we could require that that sidewalk be built. That's one idea. Bike racks. We in our zoning ordinance say for every 100 feet, you might need 2 street trees. We can also say for every commercial project, we need a bike rack if you're next to one of our bike proposed or existing bike lanes. That's something that we could require. Transportation connections, we can have something in the zoning ordinance about that as well. Perhaps it's not a specific requirement, but it's one of those standards that the Planning Commission reviews when they're looking at a specific site plan for development. The Planning Commission might say, ooh, there's a bus stop there. We're not seeing any sidewalks. Applicant, would you be amenable to putting a concrete pad in so that perhaps one day the transit agency could add benches or a shelter? That's the type of coordination and collaboration that could happen with an ordinance amendment. And there could be incentives as well that may not specifically be in a zoning ordinance amendment process, that could be in collaboration with the economic development groups in downtown Battle Creek. Maybe there are ways to incentivize the provision of different bus or bike facilities specifically in the downtown or in the neighborhood business districts. So my last slide here is the next step. So today is our virtual community meeting about this document. All of these materials will be available on the city's website. There is a link to this presentation. There's a link to the draft plan. There is a link to the network maps. So that's step number one, is hearing from you. If you have comments, you can certainly, we have Q&A during this meeting, but the city planning staff is always available to gather comments and talk to you about non-motorized transportation. And then we do want anticipate that this plan, this kind of guideline and aspirational non-motorized transportation document is reviewed by the City Planning Commission and City Council and endorsed. It wouldn't be adopted like a master plan per se. It might eventually become part of the master plan. But at this time, we're looking for endorsement and to ensure that it becomes part of the ongoing dialogue, becomes part of the budget process, and becomes part of our day-to-day thinking as we're considering growth and development in the city. So with that, I think we're open to questions and comments.
I'd like to make a comment if I could, please. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. First of all, it's very interesting because I was mayor at the time that the original non-transportation motorized transportation plan was put into effect in 06, and I noticed in this plan you omitted the same group that we omitted that showed up when it was being talked about, was the equestrian unit from Penfield that wanted to know what provisions we were making for horseback riders in the city of Battle Creek, and we just let that drop. So I just bring it up as a comment. But there has been a major shift in some shopping that probably, based on when you had your focus groups, had not yet been contemplated. And that would be one, where is the bus stop in Lakeview Square Mall relative to Horrocks? And the use of Riverside, which is the narrowest method of getting south. It's not I-194, and it's not Capitol Avenue, but the bike lane on Riverside is, of course, it's a very narrow street. The state of Michigan and the city of Battle Creek now has a law that says cars have to be 3 feet from bicycles, and it makes traveling on Riverside to Horrocks and Lakeview Square problematic. And I think that the city and needs to take a look at this and see if there's any way to correct this, because I don't see the use of Capitol Avenue increasing when we're planning on increased traffic in that. That's just a thought.
Thanks, John, for that comment, or those comments. And that is true, right? We've had some development, and that Horrocks is such an asset to the community, and it certainly brings so many people into kind of that outskirts of the downtown area. So we'll take a look at that. Your comment about Riverside. I know we'll be taking a close look at that map and consider that as well. I thought when you said shift in shopping, you were going to talk about online shopping too.
Well, that doesn't take any transportation. All it takes is a good finger to punch buttons. But yeah.
Thank you.
I thought the plan was very well written. It's very understandable. It's very clear and concise. As you said, it's not 600 pages. It's easy for a community member that gets it to work through it. I thought that with your focus groups and things were well thought out, and it's an expansion of the original 2006 plan.
Thank you. Other comments? I think you can raise your hand and we'll unmute you.
Yep, this is Eric with Communications for the City. I believe Mr. Godfrey is the only one on Zoom with us this evening, but I know Jessica, my counterpart in communications, is on YouTube, and she's got a couple questions whenever she's ready to share them.
Yes, and we got a lot of good comments about biking and sidewalks and the like that I will pull out of the comments for you, Lene, and for Darcy.
Thank you.
There are some comments about the bike lanes, and could you perhaps speak a bit more about the areas that have potential for the separation of bike lanes? Or I think you used the word buffer a lot, the buffered bike lanes. There was a question about if there would be changes to the intersections in particular for separating the bike lanes to make them more visible to the cars, especially for right turns. And there was a comment kind of going along with that, as an older person, they're afraid to bike where the bike lanes aren't wide enough and where there aren't any to begin with.
Okay, I'll take a stab at some of that, and I know Darcy and others can also share in with some of the specific areas. So I am going to share, I've got the plan itself pulled up, so I'll share over here if that works. Is the facilities, the yellow screen up right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So this is in the plan itself, and I do appreciate that comment about the width of the bike lane. And oftentimes when we're working within such constrained space, those bike lanes can be 4 feet wide, but ideally we'd like to see them 5 feet wide to provide more space. If a vehicle were to come real close, that you feel like there's ample maneuvering for you within the designated lane. The other goal is that when we're doing the dimension of that lane, that we're not including the gutter pan and that space immediately adjacent to the curb, because often there can be a change in the pavement there. There can be drainage devices that could obstruct and cause problems with bike tires. So we want to make sure that there is that ample space there, which is why we have the recommended dimensions. And moving forward, that will be the guidepost for the city when they're putting these bike lanes in. Sometimes when we're faced with very constrained areas, though, that bike lane might be 4 feet, and that's because we feel like it's important to put that bike lane in, and as opposed to not even having it because of that 1 foot. When it comes to the buffered bike lanes, we have standards and recommendations in there, as well as the intersections and sidewalk crossings. When we move into that list of the specific, well, this is that multi-use or the separated pathway. So we've identified areas where that makes sense, where we're connecting to the linear trail, the Bell Trail, the North Country Trail. More of the recreation trails is where we would see this separated pathway. It's off the street. And then I'm going to get to that list of the top priorities. And it's in this list on page 15, well, of the 14 of the PDF, but page 27 of the document, where we've identified specifically where the buffered bike lanes would be recommended. So I mentioned earlier Hamblin Avenue between South Washington and East Michigan. That's a buffered bike lane. I'm kind of looking at this because they're not all coming into my mind right away, but that's a specific one. For right now, that is kind of the priority one for that buffered bike lane. But if you have other thoughts or ideas, we encourage you to share them either through the YouTube, or you can feel free to email Darcy and others at the city. Darcy, do you have other thoughts on that?
No, I think you covered that pretty well. I will receive all of the comments also that are left on the website. So we will make sure we address those and make sure they get to the Planning Commission as well as the City Commission.
And I will say too, for people who watch this presentation after we're done being live, there are links in the chat to the plan, to the page on our website that talks about all of the things that Lene has presented and Darcy has mentioned, and also a link to a short feedback form where you can give additional comments, or, Darcy's email address. So there are lots and lots of ways to participate. From the YouTube stream, I did just want to offer to the comments that were made about sidewalks and mentioning, if there could be thoughts into different interactions about keeping sidewalks clear, especially in the wintertime for areas where when sidewalks aren't cleared off, that makes it difficult for those who are using non-motorized transportation. One of the spots that was mentioned was Main Street from Post Franklin School to the south. And they mentioned some ideas like, a competition for the best sidewalk, and we feature their sidewalk and things like that to just interact more with people, to hopefully encourage more of that clearing of sidewalks and keeping those movement ways free for people.
Great ideas. Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. And it is often, so hard in West Michigan. We're faced with this, and Central Michigan and all over where we have snow conditions. It's like keeping up with the sidewalk clearing, and also at those intersections where the sidewalk intersects with the street, often that ramp, the barrier-free ramp becomes full of snow when those snow plows pass by. So it is really, that could also be part of that educational campaign too, right? About just kind of neighborliness and the importance of clearing those crossings and your sidewalk space. And I love that idea of a competition. My neighbor competes with all of us because she posts it on Facebook, and she's always like saying how clean her sidewalk is compared to other people, that, well, you can see the concrete, and like, oh my goodness.
Mr. Godfrey, do you have any more questions? You had your hand raised there for a minute.
I do. I just want to caution, as we talk about the width of the bike lane, be sure to keep in mind the width of the street and the state and city law, where a driver has to be X number of feet from a bicycle. And we all have noted that bicyclists tend to like to ride very close to the line. And it's many of the things that you say, they don't go towards the curb because of the different material, the different heights. So they tend to push the line. And that means that the motorist on Riverside, which I travel because I live off of Riverside, if the bicyclist is hugging the line, which most of them do, and I get my 3 feet out from the bicycle, I am definitely into the oncoming lane. And it's a major consideration as you contemplate changes in the width of bike lanes, that you always remember the state law, because sure as heck, if a bicyclist is going to be hit by a car, a good defense attorney is going to come up immediately and say you are in violation of the state law because you were X number of feet from the bicyclist. And they're going to come back and say, well, that was the street that was provided by the city, et cetera, et cetera. And I have no idea where this is going to go in a court, but it needs to be constantly thought about.
Good point. Thank you.
And if there's nothing further, I'm going to leave. Thank you very much.
Thank
This
you
is
so much
this was
for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, Jessica, were there any other comments that we should, or questions that we can address?
Sorry, I had to get back to my tab here. No other questions. Some other comments throughout just about some of the conversation that's been had, like bike rental at different ends of bus routes could be a good extension.
Great
Someone
idea.
also, yeah, and someone also just mentioned to look at all things like snow plowing, for example, where on Beckley Road was the example they gave, that the crossing signal was across, a 5-foot snow pile one winter. And so that can make it difficult for pedestrians in the winter as well. Of course, a street like Beckley is large and has more snow and greater force to throw it. And so those are some of the conflicts we would run into in a spot like that. But just things like that to consider are some of the comments that people are leaving on the stream.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Okay, well, thank you, Lene. That was a nicely done presentation, and we appreciate all your work on that. If anybody else has any questions, if not, we can close out this meeting. Okay,
Thank you, everyone.
thank you. We
Thank
appreciate
you,
it.
Renee. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate it.